Imagine watching Avengers Endgame one more time, years after the movie originally ended. Tony Stark is still gone. The Avengers still save the universe. Steve Rogers still disappears into the past, and moments later, an old Steve is sitting on that bench, quietly handing Sam Wilson the shield. The story feels complete. Every major character gets their ending. Every emotional thread seems to land exactly where it should, and for years, that was the beauty of Endgame. It wasn't just the conclusion of a story, it felt like the conclusion of an era. But now imagine Marvel releasing something called Avengers Endgame Encore, adding roughly 10 minutes of completely new footage. Not enough to rewrite the movie. Not enough to change Tony's sacrifice, undo Steve's ending, or alter anything we already watched. Just 10 minutes. 10 minutes designed to answer a few questions that Endgame deliberately left hanging. And suddenly, the movie we thought we understood could start feeling very different. Because what if Steve Rogers' final mission wasn't simply about putting the Infinity Stones back where they belonged? What if, during that journey, Steve discovered something that the Avengers wouldn't understand until much later? Something that quietly connected the ending of Endgame to the beginning of Avengers Doomsday. The first edition would need to address one of Endgame's biggest unanswered questions. What exactly happened after Steve disappeared with the stones? We know the plan. The Avengers had borrowed the Infinity Stones from different moments in history, used them to reverse Thanos' snap, and then decided that every stone had to be returned to the exact moment it was taken. Bruce explains the logic. Steve is chosen to do the job. He takes the stones, the Mjolnir and the particles, and then he disappears into the timeline. But the movie cuts away. We never actually watch that journey. We never see Steve walk into those moments in history. We never see the Ancient One receive the Time Stone. We never see Jane Foster suddenly get the Reality Stone back. We never see the Red Skull watching Steve return the Soul Stone. And we certainly never see what Steve experiences while moving through those different points in time. Endgame simply asks us to trust that Steve completed the mission. But if Encore wanted to add 10 minutes that secretly prepare the MCU for Doomsday, this is exactly where the story could begin. Picture Steve standing in the sanctum, or whatever remains of that particular moment in time, holding the Time Stone in his hand. The situation is almost strangely peaceful compared to everything that came before it. There is no battle, no army, no Thanos, no Avengers. Steve simply has a responsibility to finish. He gives the stone back to the Ancient One, and for a moment, everything appears normal. But the Ancient One doesn't immediately walk away. She studies Steve. Not the shield, not the uniform, Steve himself. Because she knows something he doesn't. She understands that returning an Infinity Stone is not necessarily the same thing as restoring everything that happened because someone touched that timeline, and that distinction could become incredibly important later. Steve moves from one moment to another, quietly restoring what the Avengers borrowed. The Reality Stone returns to Jane Foster. The Soul Stone returns to Vormir, and somewhere in that journey, Steve realizes that returning the stones doesn't feel like putting a book back on a shelf. Each location carries the memory of what happened. Each timeline has already been touched. Each decision has already existed. Then, before Steve leaves, the Ancient One stops him. She gives him a warning that sounds almost meaningless in that moment. Something that the audience might even forget 5 minutes later. She tells him, every stone can be returned, but every choice cannot. Steve looks at her, trying to understand what she means. He has spent his entire life believing that if you do the right thing, you can fix what went wrong. That's essentially what this entire mission is supposed to be. Return the stones, close the branches, put everything back, move on. So Steve asks what choice she is talking about, but she doesn't answer directly. She simply looks at him and says that time remembers what people try to forget. Steve doesn't fully understand. He assumes she's talking about the alternate timelines created by the Avengers. Maybe he's even thinking about the fact that Loki escaped with the Tesseract. But the Ancient One knows there is a much bigger problem. Because the Avengers may have returned the stones, but they can't return the consequences of what they did. And that's when the montage could move faster. Steve arrives at Vormir. The atmosphere is completely different from the other locations. There is no conversation, no explanation, just Steve walking toward the place where Natasha Romanoff sacrificed herself. Red Skull watches him approach. For a second, Steve sees the same cliff where Natasha died. He understands what this place represents, and then he quietly returns the Soul Stone. Red Skull takes it. Steve turns around and leaves. Nothing seems wrong, but imagine how much more powerful that moment becomes when you realize that Steve isn't just returning objects. He's moving through the scars of the Avengers' entire history. Every stone takes him back into a different chapter of the MCU. Every return is another reminder of what the Avengers changed. And by the time he reaches 2012 New York, something feels different. Because this is where Steve would be returning the Space Stone. But the timeline isn't the one he remembers. Loki has already escaped. The Tesseract is gone. The Avengers have technically created a branch they never intended to create. Steve watches from a distance as the chaos unfolds. He sees the alternate version of himself fighting in the elevator. He sees the Avengers moving through the aftermath, and for the first time, Steve might realize something the audience didn't have the chance to think about during Endgame. The mission was never as simple as put everything back. There are moments that cannot simply be reset. Loki's escape already happened. The Avengers already existed in that timeline. Their actions already created consequences, and somewhere beyond Steve's understanding, those consequences may have been noticed by something else. That brings us to 1970. Steve returns the Tesseract to the exact moment when Howard Stark is working inside the S.H.I.E.L.D. facility. In the original movie, this moment is almost completely invisible. We know Steve and Tony were there. We know Tony successfully takes the Tesseract. We know Steve later retrieves the Pym particles, and we know they escape. That's it. But what if Encore spends 2 additional minutes inside that facility? What if the camera finally shows us what happened after Tony and Steve left? Howard Stark returns to his work. The laboratory becomes quiet again. The Tesseract is back where it belongs. Everything appears restored, until one machine glitches, not a huge explosion, not some dramatic multiversal event, just a brief malfunction. A monitor flickers. A machine that was never supposed to react suddenly activates for a fraction of a second. Howard looks toward it. The room changes, and for perhaps 2 seconds, something appears on a nearby display. Not a person we can clearly identify, not enough to reveal a face. Just the silhouette of someone wearing armor, metallic, still, watching. Howard doesn't understand what he's seeing. Steve, somewhere nearby, catches only a glimpse of the shadow before it disappears. Then everything returns to normal. The machine shuts down. The room becomes silent again. And if that were the only strange moment, you could dismiss it. Maybe it's just a technical malfunction. Maybe it's nothing. But now think about what we've already seen. The Ancient One warned Steve that every stone can be returned, but every choice cannot. Steve has watched Loki escape. He's moved through multiple timelines. He's returned the stones. And now, in 1970, something appears to have noticed the disturbance. Suddenly, the question isn't whether Steve successfully completed his mission. The question becomes whether the universe accepted the repair, because that distinction could completely change the meaning of Endgame. And this is where Bruce Banner's conversation with the Ancient One becomes far more important. In the original movie, Bruce explains that they're trying to undo what Thanos did. The Ancient One initially refuses to give up the Time Stone because removing it would create a dangerous reality. Bruce explains that Stephen Strange gave the stone to Thanos and that somehow convinces her to cooperate. She shows him the branching timeline model. She explains that removing an Infinity Stone creates a branch, but returning it to the exact moment it was taken can collapse that branch back into the original flow. It sounds almost like a mathematical solution to time travel. A simple rule: take something, use it, return it, fix the problem, but imagine extending that conversation by only a couple of minutes. Bruce looks at the branching timelines and asks the question that nobody else thinks to ask. What happens if they return everything? What happens if they do everything exactly right? The Ancient One looks at him and answers, "Time forgives mistakes. The multiverse doesn't." Bruce doesn't understand, and neither does the audience, at least not yet, because that line changes the entire philosophy of Endgame's time travel. Suddenly, the Avengers aren't dealing with one timeline that can simply be repaired. They're dealing with a larger system of realities that can remember what happened. Time may be able to close a wound, but the multiverse can preserve the scar. And that would explain why the Ancient One seems so cautious about something Bruce believes is completely logical. She isn't afraid that the Avengers will fail to return the stones. She's afraid of what their actions have already set into motion. That also gives Steve's journey a completely different emotional weight. He isn't simply completing a checklist, he's walking through the consequences of his team's choices, one stone at a time, without realizing that he's leaving something behind. The Avengers believe they were borrowing pieces of history, but perhaps, from the perspective of the multiverse, they were opening doors. Every jump was another connection between realities. Every interaction was another opportunity for something to see them. And the most frightening possibility is that someone eventually did. Which brings Steve to the final part of his journey. Peggy Carter. The moment we've always treated as Steve Rogers' perfect ending. After everything he's lost, everything he's sacrificed, and every battle he's survived, Steve finally chooses something for himself. He returns to the past. He finds Peggy. They dance. And for a character who spent most of his life being told to move forward, Steve finally stops running toward the next war. He simply stays. It's beautiful because it feels like peace. But what if that scene contained one tiny detail that changed everything? The dance ends. Steve looks out the window. Peggy is still nearby. For just a second, Steve notices something outside. The sky seems to distort. A faint green and purple fracture appears above the horizon. It's there for barely a moment. Then it's gone. Peggy asks him if everything is all right. Steve looks back at her. Yeah, he smiles. But he doesn't sound completely certain. And maybe that's the point. Because Steve doesn't know what he's looking at. He doesn't know what the Ancient One meant. He doesn't know what happened in the 1970 laboratory. He doesn't know that somewhere, somehow, the multiverse may have noticed the Avengers. All Steve knows is that something feels wrong. And then, Endgame ends exactly the way we remember it. Or at least, it appears to. Because if Marvel really wanted to connect this story to Avengers Doomsday, there would be one final piece missing. One scene that doesn't explain the mystery. One scene that simply reveals that somebody else has been watching. The screen goes black. For a few seconds, there's nothing. Then an old television turns on. On the screen are moments we've already seen. Tony Stark snapping his fingers. Loki escaping with the Tesseract. Bruce speaking to the Ancient One. Steve returning to the past. The dance with Peggy. Different moments from Endgame playing again and again, almost like someone is studying them. Not watching them for entertainment, analyzing them. The camera slowly pulls back. Someone is sitting in front of the television. We don't see his face, only his silhouette. He reaches forward and turns the television off, and then, in the darkness, we hear his voice. So, this is where they broke reality. Silence. The man places something on the table. A metal mask. We don't see the face behind it. We don't need to. The screen cuts to black. And then appears a title we've been waiting for. Avengers Doomsday. If Marvel actually did something like this, the most interesting part wouldn't be the 10 minutes themselves. It would be what those 10 minutes do to the movie we already know. Endgame wouldn't have been rewritten. Tony would still die. Thanos would still lose. Steve would still return the stones. The Avengers would still win. But suddenly, that victory wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the moment the next story quietly began. And that possibility makes Steve's final journey far more important than it initially appears. Because if the multiverse really does remember the Avengers' actions, then Steve was the one person who physically moved through almost every point where those consequences began. He wasn't standing safely outside the timeline watching events unfold. He was inside them. He touched the stones. He entered the realities. He saw what had changed. And most importantly, he was there at the exact moment when the Avengers believed everything had been repaired. That is why the 1970 sequence could become the hidden centerpiece of this entire theory. In Endgame, Steve and Tony's trip to 1970 feels like a detour designed mostly to give us one of the movie's most emotional conversations between Tony and Howard Stark. Tony gets to see his father. Howard unknowingly gives Tony the reassurance he spent his entire life looking for. It's beautiful, and emotionally, the scene works perfectly. But from a larger perspective, something about that timeline is still strangely unexplored. The Tesseract is returned. The Avengers leave. Howard continues working, and life moves on, unless it doesn't. Because S.H.I.E.L.D. wasn't simply storing a random alien cube in 1970. The Tesseract was one of the most mysterious objects on Earth. Howard Stark knew its potential. S.H.I.E.L.D. was studying it. And the MCU has repeatedly established that advanced technology can sometimes become the bridge between things that shouldn't normally connect. So if that laboratory briefly reacted to the temporal disturbance caused by Steve and Tony's arrival, the event wouldn't necessarily need to create an explosion. It could be something much quieter, a signal, a fluctuation, a momentary connection between 2 points that should never have touched. And if someone, somewhere, was capable of detecting that signal, then the 1970 scene stops being a simple time heist sequence. It becomes the first moment when somebody outside the Avengers' understanding notices that reality has been disturbed. The important thing is that this person wouldn't have to be Dr. Doom yet. In fact, revealing Doom too early would weaken the entire idea. The power of the scene comes from not knowing who is watching. We see the armored silhouette, but there is no face, no name, no explanation. Just enough visual information to make the audience uncomfortable. Because the moment viewers recognize that somebody is monitoring these events, every previous scene starts carrying a different weight. The Avengers aren't necessarily being attacked. They are being observed. An observation can be much more dangerous than an attack, because whoever is watching doesn't need to interfere immediately. They can wait. They can study. They can learn. Think about the television in that hypothetical post-credits scene. Why would someone replay those specific moments from Endgame? Why Tony's snap? Why Loki's escape? Why the Ancient One conversation? Why Steve and Peggy? At first, those clips might seem random, but together, they represent something much bigger. They are the exact moments where the Avengers interacted with forces beyond their original reality. Time travel. Infinity Stones, branching timelines, sacrifice, multiversal consequences. Someone isn't watching Endgame. They're studying the moment reality became vulnerable. And suddenly, that line becomes much more disturbing. So, this is where they broke reality. Because the person saying it doesn't sound surprised. He sounds like he's been looking for the answer. That also changes how we might interpret the Ancient One's warning. Every stone can be returned, but every choice cannot. If that line existed, it wouldn't necessarily mean Steve failed. In fact, Steve could have completed the mission perfectly. Every stone could have been returned exactly where it belonged. The problem would be that the Avengers had already made choices that couldn't be erased. Tony and Steve still traveled to 1970. Loki still escaped in 2012. Natasha still sacrificed herself. Bruce still spoke to the Ancient One. Steve still chose to return to Peggy. The objects can go back. The memories can't. The consequences can't. And that's an important distinction, because Endgame's entire plan depends on the idea that history can be restored by putting the stones back. But maybe the Avengers misunderstood the scale of what they were dealing with. They were thinking like people repairing a broken machine. The Ancient One was thinking like someone who understands the architecture of reality itself. And if the multiverse doesn't forget, then the Avengers' victory against Thanos may have created a completely different problem, not immediately, not visibly, but somewhere beneath the surface. That would also give Avengers Doomsday a much stronger connection to Endgame than simply bringing back familiar characters or introducing another cosmic threat. The story wouldn't begin because Doom suddenly appears. It would begin because something that happened years earlier finally reaches its consequence, and that's much more frightening. Because when a villain appears out of nowhere, you can ask where they came from. But when the villain is the consequence of something the heroes already did, the story becomes personal. Imagine watching Doomsday after seeing this extended version of Endgame. When Dr. Doom finally talks about the collapse of realities, the audience wouldn't just think, "Here comes another multiverse villain." They would remember Steve standing in front of the Ancient One. They would remember the strange machine in 1970. They would remember that brief crack in the sky. They would remember the television replaying the Avengers' choices. And then one line from Doom could suddenly make everything click. He doesn't need to say that he caused the multiversal crisis. He could simply say that he found it. Because that would fit perfectly with the idea that Doom isn't necessarily the person who created the problem. He could be the person who understood it before everyone else did. And that distinction matters. We've seen villains who want power. We've seen villains who want revenge. We've seen villains who want to destroy the universe because they believe existence itself is flawed. But Doom can be much more interesting if his motivation is built around control. If he looks at a multiverse where realities are constantly colliding, where timelines branch uncontrollably, where civilizations disappear because of decisions made by people who don't even know those civilizations exist, then Doom may genuinely believe that the heroes are incapable of protecting reality, and from his perspective, he might have a point. The Avengers used time travel to undo a catastrophe. They brought people back. They defeated Thanos. They saved billions. But in doing so, they may have opened doors that they didn't know how to close. Doom could look at that and reach a terrifying conclusion. Someone has to take control. And if that someone is Victor Von Doom, then suddenly his presence in Doomsday isn't just about being another powerful villain. He becomes the answer to a question that Endgame accidentally created. What happens when heroes save their universe, but damage the multiverse in the process? That question becomes even more interesting when you look back at Steve Rogers. Because Steve is the person who believes most strongly in fixing things. He spends his entire life fighting for a world he believes can be better. He refuses to give up on people. He refuses to accept that certain sacrifices are meaningless. And when he finally gets the chance to choose his own life, he chooses Peggy. But if the sky really did crack above them for that 1 second, then Steve's happy ending isn't completely untouched. Maybe he sees it. Maybe he understands that something is wrong. Maybe he chooses not to tell Peggy. Not because he's hiding some terrible secret, but because after everything he's been through, he finally understands that not every problem needs to be fought immediately. Steve has spent decades carrying responsibility for everyone else. Maybe this is the one moment where he chooses peace, and that makes the scene more tragic rather than less beautiful. Because Steve gets his life with Peggy, but the multiverse keeps moving. Somewhere else, another reality is collapsing. Somewhere else, another version of Earth is facing an impossible threat. Somewhere else, someone is discovering the existence of worlds beyond their own. And eventually, all of those realities begin moving toward the same point, Doomsday. This could also explain why the post-credit scene should be so restrained. There shouldn't be a giant fight, no army, no explosion, no giant reveal showing Doom standing on a throne. The audience doesn't need any of that. They already know enough. A television, a few moments from Endgame, a voice, a mask. That's it. Because the real horror comes from realizing that someone has been watching the same movie we just watched. Except they're seeing something we didn't. They're seeing the pattern. They're seeing the moments connect. They're seeing the cracks. And when that person says, this is where they broke reality, the word they becomes important. Not I, not we, they. The Avengers, the heroes, the people who thought they were saving everyone. That one word would tell us everything about how Doom sees them. He doesn't necessarily consider himself responsible for the coming disaster. He considers himself the person cleaning up their mistake. And that creates a very different kind of conflict for Doomsday. Because when the Avengers eventually confront Doom, the argument may not simply be about who is stronger. It could be about who deserves to decide the future of reality. The Avengers believe people should have the freedom to choose their own destiny. Doom may believe that freedom is exactly what destroyed the multiverse, and if he has spent years studying the consequences of the Endgame time heist, then he could know things the Avengers don't. He could know about timelines they never saw. He could know about worlds created by choices they thought were insignificant. He could know why certain realities began collapsing. He could know what happened after Loki disappeared with the Tesseract. Most importantly, he could know that the Avengers were never looking at the entire picture. They were only looking at their own universe, and perhaps that's the real purpose of this hypothetical encore footage. Not to introduce Doom, not to explain the multiverse, not even to set up the next Avengers movie directly. Its purpose would be to change the meaning of something we already watched. That's one of the most effective ways to build a cinematic universe. You don't always need to add another story. Sometimes you just need to show the audience that the story they already know was missing a piece. Think about the difference between watching Endgame before this footage and watching it afterward. Before, Steve disappears and we assume he completes his mission. Afterward, we know he encountered warnings. Before, the 1970 sequence is a beautiful father-son moment between Tony and Howard. Afterward, we wonder what that strange machine detected. Before, Bruce's conversation with the Ancient One explains the rules of time travel. Afterward, we realize she may have been warning him about something much larger. Before, Steve and Peggy's dance is simply a happy ending. Afterward, that brief distortion in the sky makes us wonder whether even Steve's new life existed outside the consequences of the Avengers' actions. And before, Endgame's ending feels like the end of something. Afterward, it feels like a door, and that may be the most important distinction of all. Because the MCU has always been built on the idea that one story can quietly plant the seed for another. Sometimes the seed isn't obvious until years later. A line that sounded like exposition suddenly becomes important. A character who seemed insignificant becomes central. A location that seemed like background becomes the key to the next story. This theory simply applies that same philosophy to Endgame's ending. What if the biggest clue to Doomsday was never hidden inside a new movie? What if it was hidden inside the one movie we thought had already told us everything? And that brings us back to those hypothetical 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes. 3 minutes of Steve returning the stones. 2 minutes in 1970. 2 minutes with Bruce and the Ancient One. 1.5 minutes with Steve and Peggy. And 1 final 1.5 minutes revealing that somebody has been watching. On paper, that doesn't sound like much. But storytelling isn't about how much footage you add. It's about what that footage changes. And if those 10 minutes could transform Endgame from a finished conclusion into the first chapter of Doomsday, then they wouldn't really be extra scenes. They would be missing pieces. Pieces that were sitting between the lines of a story we thought we already understood. And the beauty of that idea is that none of it requires Endgame to have been wrong. In fact, it works because Endgame could still be completely right. The Avengers did save everyone they were trying to save. They did defeat Thanos. Steve did return the stones. The original timeline survived. The people who disappeared came back. The universe kept moving. The movie's ending doesn't need to be undone for the theory to work. The hidden problem exists somewhere underneath the victory, and that makes the story much more interesting because the heroes don't have to be punished for failing. They can be forced to face the consequences of succeeding in a way they never fully understood. That's something Marvel could potentially use to make Doomsday feel connected to the entire MCU, rather than simply connected to a handful of characters, because the multiverse saga has always been about consequences. One universe exists beside another. One choice creates another reality. One timeline survives while another branches away, and eventually those realities can come into contact with each other. But if the Avengers time heist was the moment when the boundaries between those realities became unusually vulnerable, then Endgame becomes the historical event that started the chain reaction. And suddenly, even the smallest decisions during the time heist become more important. Take Loki's escape. In Endgame, the Avengers don't intend for Loki to steal the Tesseract. It happens because Hulk crashes into Tony, Tony drops the case, Loki grabs the Tesseract, and suddenly, the entire situation changes. The original Avengers don't even have time to react before Loki disappears. Steve and Tony then realize they have no choice but to travel further back to 1970. From a storytelling perspective, it's a clever complication. It gives Tony and Steve another problem to solve. But from the perspective of this theory, Loki's escape becomes one of the first visible cracks, because the Avengers didn't plan for that reality to exist. They didn't plan for Loki to escape. They didn't plan for that branch. And they certainly didn't know what would happen to it afterward. Maybe that's exactly the kind of event the Ancient One was talking about. A choice that cannot simply be returned. The Tesseract can be returned, but Loki already touched it. He already made the decision. He already disappeared. The timeline already experienced a different version of history. And if someone was monitoring the multiverse, that could have been one of the first moments they noticed the disturbance. Then there's 1970. Tony and Steve don't simply travel through time. They interact with Howard Stark. Tony has a conversation with his father that never happened in the original timeline. Howard sees his son without knowing who he really is. Tony tells him that being a father is the most important job in the world. Howard says something that Tony desperately needed to hear. It's one of the most emotional moments in the entire movie, but technically, it's also an impossible interaction. Tony Stark was never supposed to meet Howard Stark in that moment. And if the multiverse remembers choices, then this matters. Tony didn't just borrow the Tesseract, he stepped into his father's life. He changed a conversation that was never supposed to happen. Maybe that doesn't create a catastrophic alternate universe. Maybe it doesn't even change Howard's future. But it is another piece of evidence that the Avengers' mission was never as clean as they believed. And that could make the mysterious 1970 glitch much more meaningful. Imagine Howard looking at that machine after Steve and Tony leave. The system begins malfunctioning, but not because the Tesseract is missing. The Tesseract is already back. Everything should be normal, except something has changed. The machine isn't detecting the stone, it's detecting the timeline. For 2 seconds, the laboratory receives information from somewhere else. A different reality, a different future, a different version of Earth. And inside that transmission is a silhouette. The audience doesn't know whether the figure is Doom, another variant, or something completely unrelated. But the image stays with them. Then the movie moves on. That's important, because a good mystery shouldn't immediately explain itself. If Encore were to show the silhouette and then immediately reveal Dr. Doom, the mystery would disappear. But if it simply plants the image, then the audience carries it forward. And when Doomsday eventually arrives, viewers start asking a question: was that him? If the answer is yes, then the entire story suddenly becomes much bigger. Because Doom didn't appear after Endgame. He was already looking. And if the answer is no, The mystery becomes even more interesting because Marvel could be telling us that the multiverse contains something even larger than Doom. Either way, the scene would create anticipation without giving away the destination. That's exactly what a post-credit scene should do. But there's another layer to Steve's return journey that could make the theory emotionally stronger. Steve is the one person who knows what happened. Not everything, but more than anyone else. He physically travels through those moments. He returns the stones. He sees the consequences. He talks to the Ancient One. He witnesses the alternate 2012. He returns the Tesseract to 1970, and then he chooses to remain in the past. Which means when Sam asks him about his journey at the end of Endgame, Steve could be carrying information that the audience never hears. Maybe that's why he doesn't explain where he has been. Maybe he doesn't say, "The Ancient One warned me." Maybe he doesn't say, "Something followed me." Maybe he doesn't say, "I saw something in 1970." Because Steve has always understood that some information can be dangerous. And perhaps, after everything he's been through, he makes one final decision. He lets the next generation handle what comes next. That's why Sam receiving the shield becomes even more meaningful. Steve isn't simply retiring, he's handing responsibility forward. He knows his era is over. He knows the world is changing. And somewhere beyond the timeline he chose for himself, something else is coming. That makes his final smile to Sam more complicated. It's still hopeful. But maybe Steve isn't completely unaware of what's waiting ahead. And that could be one of the reasons the hypothetical encore footage should never turn Steve into someone who secretly knows everything. That would undermine the character. Steve shouldn't suddenly become a multiverse expert. He shouldn't know who Doom is. He shouldn't understand incursions or whatever larger phenomenon eventually threatens reality. He only needs to know that something is wrong. That is enough. Because sometimes the strongest foreshadowing isn't a character explaining the future. It's a character realizing that the present doesn't make sense. And Steve's story has always been about that feeling. A man out of time. A man watching the world change around him. A man trying to understand where he belongs. So when he looks at that strange fracture in the sky and tells Peggy that everything is fine, there is something quietly heartbreaking about it. Maybe he knows it isn't, but for once he chooses to stay. And that makes the scene feel less like an interruption to his happy ending and more like a reminder that even heroes don't get to control everything. The universe keeps moving, time keeps moving, and eventually the consequences catch up. That's where Dr. Doom enters the story. Not as the man who caused every problem, but as the man who understands the problem better than anyone else. And if that's the version of Doom Marvel chooses, then his conflict with the Avengers becomes almost philosophical. The Avengers believe that the future should remain open. Doom believes that an uncontrolled future is dangerous. The Avengers trust people to make their own choices. Doom sees those choices as the source of chaos. The Avengers save the universe because they refuse to accept the future Thanos created. Doom could argue that their rebellion against one inevitable future simply created thousands of unstable ones. And if he has spent years studying those realities, then from his perspective, he isn't the villain, he's the solution. That's what makes a villain like Doom dangerous. He doesn't need to believe he's evil, he can believe he's necessary. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is that the Avengers might not be able to completely prove him wrong. Because look at the evidence. Thanos attacked one universe. The Avengers defeated him. But after that, reality itself became more complicated. Loki escaped. Timelines branched. Different versions of familiar characters began appearing. Universes came into contact with each other, and eventually, the Avengers faced a threat that isn't simply one villain trying to conquer Earth, it's the collapse of the boundaries between realities. If Doom looks at all of that and says, "You did this," the Avengers can deny responsibility, but they can't deny that their actions are part of the history. And that creates a conflict that can't be solved by punching harder. Tony Stark can't fix it with another suit. Thor can't simply summon more lightning. Captain America can't solve it with the shield. Because this time, the question isn't whether the Avengers can defeat an enemy. It's whether they have the right to decide what happens to everyone else's reality. And that's where the 10 minutes of Avengers Endgame encore would ultimately pay off. The footage wouldn't be there to say, "Here is the entire explanation for Doomsday." It would be there to plant a much more unsettling idea. The Avengers won Endgame, but their victory may have started something they couldn't see. And that means when Doomsday begins, the audience isn't watching a completely new story. They're watching the consequences of an old one. That's the difference between a sequel that simply follows a movie and a sequel that recontextualizes it. And if Marvel ever wanted to make the MCU feel like one enormous connected story again, this would be one of the cleanest ways to do it. Because the clues don't need to be enormous. They don't need to explain everything. They just need to make us look backward. The Ancient One's warning, the 1970 glitch, the strange figure, the crack above Steve and Peggy, the television, the mask. 5 tiny pieces, and together they create a completely different interpretation of Endgame. The Avengers thought they were closing the door on the past, but maybe they only closed the door they could see. And somewhere beyond it, another door had already opened. That's why the final image of the mask would work so well, not because the mask itself is shocking. We already know who Dr. Doom is. The real shock is the implication behind it. Someone has been studying the Avengers. Someone knows where the disturbance began. Someone knows that the stones were moved. Someone knows about the branches. Someone knows that reality was touched. And perhaps most importantly, someone has been patient enough to wait. Because Doom doesn't need to arrive the moment the Avengers make their mistake. He can arrive when the consequences finally become impossible to ignore. And that is what would make the opening of Doomsday feel inevitable, not random. Not forced, not disconnected from the past, inevitable. The final lesson of this theory is that Endgame wouldn't need another massive battle scene to set up Doomsday. It wouldn't need 10 minutes of exposition explaining every rule of the multiverse. It wouldn't need a character standing in front of a screen saying exactly what is going to happen. It would only need to show us the one thing Endgame never showed us. What happened after Steve left? Because for years we've treated that moment as a simple epilogue. Steve returns the stones. He goes back to Peggy. He lives his life. Then he gives Sam the shield, the end. But what if Steve's journey wasn't just the final chapter of Endgame? What if it was the first chapter of Doomsday? Then the story becomes beautifully circular. Endgame begins with the Avengers trying to undo the consequences of Thanos, and Doomsday begins with someone confronting the consequences of the Avengers. Endgame is about heroes traveling through time to save their future. Doomsday could be about someone from another reality looking back at that journey and deciding that the heroes can no longer be trusted with the future. And in the middle of both stories is the same idea: choice. The choice to travel through time, the choice to steal the stones, the choice to return them, the choice to save everyone, the choice to escape, the choice to stay. The Ancient One's warning suddenly becomes the perfect summary of the entire theory. Every stone can be returned, but every choice cannot. And maybe that's what Endgame was really leaving behind. Not a broken timeline, not a simple mistake, a consequence, something that couldn't be undone because it wasn't an object, it was a decision. The Avengers made the decision to change history. They made the decision to bring everyone back. They made the decision to risk the multiverse because they believed saving their universe was worth it. And honestly, they were probably right. That's what makes the story tragic. They did the right thing. They just didn't know what the right thing would cost. And if Doctor Doom is the person who eventually comes to collect that cost, then the most terrifying thing about him isn't his armor, his intelligence, his power, or even his ambition. It's that he may have been watching the entire time, watching the moment the Tesseract disappeared, watching the timelines branch, watching Steve return the stones, watching the universe heal, and waiting for the moment when it finally became clear that the wound had never completely closed. So if Avengers Endgame Encore ever did add roughly 10 minutes of footage like this, it wouldn't simply be giving fans more Endgame. It would be giving us a new reason to watch the old movie. And suddenly, every time Steve disappears at the end, we'd know there's more to that journey. Every time we see the 1970 sequence, we'd wonder what happened after Tony and Steve left. Every time the Ancient One explains the rules of time travel, we'd listen more carefully. Every time we see Steve dance with Peggy, we'd look toward the sky. And when that final television turns on and the Avengers' greatest moments begin playing again, we'd understand exactly what we're watching. Not a recap, an investigation. Someone is going back through the history of the Avengers, searching for the exact moment everything changed. And when that metal mask finally touches the table, the mystery is no longer about whether reality was broken. The mystery is about what happens when the person who discovers the crack decides to control everything on the other side, because maybe Endgame wasn't the moment the multiverse ended. Maybe it was the moment the multiverse became aware of the Avengers, and if that's true, then Avengers Doomsday isn't where this story begins. It's where the consequences finally arrive, and that would make those 10 hypothetical minutes some of the most important minutes Marvel could ever add to Endgame. Not because they change what happened, but because they change what it meant. And suddenly, the movie we thought was about the end would reveal that it was always about what came next. If you enjoyed this theory, make sure to like the video, share it with another Marvel fan, and subscribe to MovieCast for more MCU theories and breakdowns. And if you want to support the channel even more, you can also send a $25 super thanks. I really appreciate it. Until next time, keep watching closely, because in the MCU, the smallest detail can sometimes change the entire story.